Anna Neimark is a full-time faculty at SciArc. Prior to founding First Office, Anna worked at Johnson, Markley, and OMA. She holds a BA in architecture from Princeton University and a master from Harvard GSD. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you, Gary, so much for inviting me. Gary and I, know each other for more than 20 years. It's really wonderful to be here and to see you in a more like professional context. Hello to everybody. I mean, of course, in Los Angeles here, it's 9 in the morning. So it's really wonderful to participate also in this kind of cross-Atlantic conversation. And it's actually kind of amazing to present in the same space as, Baukunst and Cecile, you're here. I thought it was very important what you said, which is that architectural production is really cultural production. And so in many ways, I think there are some similarities in terms of what I would like to speak about and what you've already spoken about earlier today. Okay, so I'd like to talk about the models at First Office. We have a very small practice here in LA with my partner, Andrew Atwood. And in particular, I thought, it's very important to kind of speak to the models themselves, as you have done as well, and not to show so much the built work, but to kind of begin to talk about a little bit of the translation. Something that maybe my question and also Paolo's question about what does it mean to not only work through, let's say, drawings or different modes of representation, but really to work through physical models as a way to set up a kind of discourse within the architectural production. And one of the things that we always look at, of course, are just like models by everybody else. And in particular, in this case, the models of Michelangelo, let's say, in the very first even representation of a model. I mean, this is something that Maxime also spoke about. What do we do with models when it comes to not just the object as such, but actually the representation of the object? Here we see in Domenico Cresti's painting, the actual representation of a model being presented by Michelangelo to Pope Pius, and of course, the architect dressed in black, the Pope dressed in white, the model white, against the background of representation of a kind of landscape, let's say. And, when you begin to see what this means for the actual model itself, we can see it in the, one moment. I'm connected to my phone as well, so I think I have a little bit of a overlap between the two. But what's really amazing, and you can see in the kind of model of the kind of carpenters from the fabric of Michelangelo, that the model is also constructed for that image. That there is an idea about the kind of frontality and also the kind of back of house, right? So when we look at the back of the dome, the model is actually quite rude and crudely constructed because of the way in which it has to be chiseled out of a kind of monumental piece of wood. And so what we pay attention to is kind of both the front side, the kind of decorative and the ornamental versus the back side. And, this is like what you've spoken about as well. The fond, the background, what is lurking in the background of a model becomes super important for us. And this is something that we really understand as the substrate of architectural production, which is to say, if in painting there was a kind of medium specificity related to the materials of painting that produced a kind of art for art, let's say 20th century concept of production in a certain medium. What happens in the medium of architecture when the media are not only limited to one or two materials or to one or two concepts, when it's everything all at the same time? So the idea of, let's say, the substrate for architecture becomes really, I think, represented by this idea of the maquette, of the architectural model, and all of the different materials and forces that are part of its production. And so we look at the actual substrate of paper, of wood, of different ways of construction, and we look toward these kinds of modern I guess, models, other way to use the word model, perhaps, of Rauschenberg, of Cocteau, of actually kind of understanding what it means to really erase the content and to move into the background as a way to begin to understand the specificity of certain materials and certain construction. And so we look at things that are erased. You know, this goes back to Gary's also question earlier today. What do you do when you begin to produce a kind of blankness and a kind of work through erasure rather than through addition? What is left behind is a kind of structure that is conceptual. And so in many ways, the materials and the models that we look at are not only related to the kind of imageability and the materiality of something that is frontal, but also to kind of conceptual thinking in the background that is really something that produces the infrastructure of the substrate. You know, so of course in the American kind of sensibility, this is the project of like 1970s, and in particular with Eisenman within our own discipline, something that comes forward in this design quarterly from 1970 that was put together by John Margolis as a kind of way to say that there is perhaps a way to produce a kind of context for the work without really necessarily understanding what the kind of representation actually could become. So there are kind of like gaps in this project, and the way in which we really understand how to speak to this is to say that, you know, a lot of things that we put forward are done through a kind of very specific documentation. And here, you know, we want to kind of switch from thinking of form as that related to objects to form that is related to formulaire, which is to say the form of a document, and how to understand the kind of backgrounds of professional practice through some of these other modes of representation, of kind of documentation, and of presentation of certain kinds of proposals, ideas, even at moments quite legal. And so it also kind of course, goes back to conversations about the role of authorship, because when it is not a project about, let's say, content, but it's a project about the background, there is a kind of, and I present here the certificate of death, because there is a kind of death of the author that actually begins to be reenacted through the idea of filling in the blank form of architecture, right? So if we look towards certain kinds of models out in the field, we can begin to understand them as those things that lack specificity, and perhaps through our office, we can begin to add certain kind of specific materials, practices, processes to understand how to find a kind of sensibility of authorship, but also sensibility of reference within the field. And this is what, as Cecile has said, it's like a very cultural project, because it becomes something that is more than material. Now, I won't show some of the earlier work. I wanted to kind of show where we're at in the last few years, but we started the project with Andrew looking at the work of Kazimir Malevich in particular, because of course this is le degré zéro. This is like the 0 degree of the kind of blank formulaire, the project of abstraction in a sense, and the kind of suprematism as something that really structures our thinking, because it's not about really reproducing some sort of mimetic presentation through the model, but it's about finding a kind of its own relevance. This is, I think, what Paolo, you were saying, like, maquette sur même, the model for itself, its own sake. And so what that becomes is maybe different for each office, but in a sense, this was the first maquette that we built on the right, which is a really large kind of table for the offices at Pinterest. And the idea is just to kind of begin to understand through the specificity of the materials, through the specificity of scale, how to begin to bridge certain gaps between rendering and modeling, or between rendering and kind of the material world of construction. Of course, our own office doesn't look anything like that. It doesn't look clean or pristine or minimalist. There is a lot of junk in the office. This is my partner, Andrew Atwood, always working, always in kind of conversation. Also, just to point out, I mean, of course, we're always speaking to one another and working with our hands. And I loved all the pictures also that Guillaume presented from the kind of process, because I think making models, we always present them quite clean, but actually the process is quite messy. And you can see also, the kind of different types of things that we are always conversing with, including just different materials, but also like robots, CNC mills, 3D printers, things that kind of begin to produce a conversation from different media and different, in a sense, technical infrastructures, because I think with each project, we try to understand the actual kind of milieu, the kind of limitations of each material or each instrument in order to bring out and to express, to kind of make visible what it is that we're working with. So it's a kind of, I would say almost like, I would say like if there's anything lurking in the background, it's really a Marxism about how materials have a kind of association with the way in which we work with them by understanding a kind of labor and the process, the time, the kind of activities surrounding a certain kind of construction and even construction sites. And so those things, they always come to the foreground in the work. But at the same time, we look at models that are already ready-made, in a sense, within the architectural discourse or art discourse, to imagine kind of how, even in very small ways, we can actually, in a sense, make a little bit of a distinction. So in the case of looking at, let's say, essays by Russell and Krauss, it's been really important to us to begin to understand that abstraction already exists in the world of the real. To look at something like the painting by Caspar David Friedrich allows us to understand that the mullions of the windows themselves, the way in which they're constructed, either reinforce the kind of flatness of painting or in fact propose perspectival lines that move toward a kind of vanishing point, producing, let's say, the 19th century landscape. And so we cannot unsee the fact that mullions within windows are themselves the kind of reminder of the grid or of the perspectival space of painting. And we kind of think about the way in which certain ways in which we represent migrate into the ways in which we live, right? So there's a kind of a rapport between, let's say, thinking art historically, actually in real life, let's say IRL. And then at the same time, we look at things, and practices such as Marcel Duchamp's, because of the way in which we can understand certain philosophical models to be certainly also, representational of a kind of blankness within our world. So rather than starting from scratch, we always start with something that is, in a sense, a cultural manifest or something that exists in the world, but we begin to understand how to make it more specific to a kind of architectural discourse. So let's say in the door that opens one space as it encloses another, we understand it to be a kind of philosophical model for how to understand spatial ambiguity, but at the same time, we understand that its limitations are within its construction, because it is kind of built without the detail of an architect's kind of point of view. So for us, in a sense, filling in a door such as this one, thinking of it as a kind of blank form or a blank formulaire, allows us to understand how to bring a kind of specificity, how to write the text back into this model to understand what it means for our practice. And so we produce images such as this one, where a kind of double door of Marcel Duchamp begins to produce a kind of ambiguity of four rooms in relationship to one another. And in particular, it kind of also bends the ways of construction or ornamentation around the specificities of certain elements. So when two doors by Duchamp meet one another, they cannot meet precisely at a cross. They have to kind of be offset to produce a gap or a space for a structural member to actually hold those frames apart and at the same time together. And you can also see that the molding that moves around the kind of door also has to bend at certain corners to begin to produce continuities of ornament. And so we have to kind of work with real kind of scaled lumber materials that allow us to begin to understand the material thicknesses and the kind of rapport between, let's say, the structural rhythms as well as kind of ornamental forms. So a model such as this of the Duchamp doors is constructed from scaled lumber, and it kind of takes the realism, let's say, into kind of one-to-one, kind of representation, but where you can actually begin to understand the continuities of vernacular construction in relationship to kind of spatial and even, I guess, audio relations. And so this model is made with wood, it's made with paint, it's made with carpet, it's put together with magnets so that we can begin to really understand the kind of rotations of certain parts. As a kind of element that begins to, let's say, organize a form of a house, you can see that, within the space of each double door, the hinge that kind of offsets the doors one from the other produces also different rhythms within the plan, such that certain rooms can be actually made smaller and larger depending on that one element. So there's a kind of scalability, I guess, from a detail to the rest of the plan that allows for this to take on certain kind of nuance and hierarchy within the scheme. This is just a kind of section through the project, but when you begin to kind of understand the translation, let's say, from the model to the full-scale object, you can see that there are actually certain things that are added even further. For example, when the door stops, the magnet of the model has to translate into a doorstop, which actually grows the wall by another kind of 4 centimeters in order to understand that the door cannot swing off its hinges. And so there are certain things that begin to be added even further in the construction of the actual object for kind of full-scale representation. The question of the background has become kind of fundamental because we've in the US, we don't have very many opportunities to build, or at least as much as maybe in the European practices. So what we do quite a bit is work with galleries, with artists, and kind of think through the model of the exhibition as a way to produce a kind of younger practice. And what we've noticed quite a bit is that the question of the model becomes the question of an architectural object that sits kind of in the middle of the room when it comes to the exhibition space. And what we've tried to do is really understand the architectural kind of model, not as something that sits in the middle as an object, but something that sits actually at the perimeter of the space as a kind of background, as architecture should be, in a sense, like in the background of it all, rather than in the middle. And so every time we're kind of given a space to work, we try to understand how to a bit like sabotage that space into something that can actually take on some of the qualities that we're interested in, that have to do exactly with the questions of the specificities of the substrate, of the kind of space of exposition. So in this case, we were asked to place a model on a table, but we just kind of turned the table into the model by simply giving it a certain kind of posture and kinks and construction. This was done with the kind of interest in projection techniques. I mean, these are just kind of 2-dimensional images of projecting that table back into the corner and understanding what it would be like if it were sitting, if it were kind of inscribed into a space as though it were sitting in the background rather than in the foreground. These were the models that we made based off the kind of 2-dimensional images, trying to kind of give form to a very simple kind of IKEA table. But I wanted to show that project because it really links to some of the very recent work, which really combines ideas from multiple practices. And I think that in this case, we tried to kind of go a little bit beyond the early 1920s as a point of reference, all the way back to the kind of negative 4000s, to look at some of the megalithic monuments, and in particular dolmen monuments, because they are quite beautiful. And the stacks are just really amazing, and I would say like super architectural. We look at something like this in part because it offers us a way to kind of translate a model which is 6,000 years old into something that actually exists in our kind of contemporary time. And so the question here was to take the possibility of kind of collapsing time, collapsing space, and really looking at models that are prehistoric and kind of global, and not only those that are kind of close at hand. But so in particular, it allows us to also understand how certain qualities can travel from one material practice to another. So we'll look at this as a kind of, I mean, this is another way to maybe define the idea of model, in that it's not something that is kind of built as a miniature of something else, but maybe in this case, the model is actually kind of, built 6,000 years ago out of solid stone. And in fact, what we make is almost like a copy that is quite cheap from the original. We call this thing root forms among us, because these were understood to be root stone monuments made of root, not hewn stone. And so we try to understand how to translate certain forms back into a kind of scale of a house, something that is at our own kind of understanding of scale. Now, the project also combines multiple forms of research. We worked with Frédéric Gaillard, who is a curator in the museum in Toulouse, and who is a kind of keeper of a collection of Eugène Troutat. He's a photographer of all kinds of 19th century kind of landscapes, buildings, and artifacts. He's a natural historian. And so we looked at the collection that was kind of sitting in a vault, a collection from 1900 of these prehistoric monuments. And we tried to understand how to combine ideas about photography and building, and to kind of begin to translate, let's say, a photograph into some sort of new construction. And so if you can imagine that the translation kind of requires a certain amount of decision making, certain amount of specificity that's related to it, this was kind of the conversation that we had with Frédéric in order to both exhibit the originals and the kind of projects that exist side by side. We included we brought to Los Angeles 2 of the prints of Troutat, which were the original kind of prints from 1900. They were printed on negative paper, a project that he kind of, technique that he initiated. But at the same time, we kind of took that megalithic monument and blew it up to 4 times its size in order to then construct it in the space of Los Angeles. And I include this particular project because I really think of it as a kind of model, but like at a very large scale, let's say, because the parts are still related to the way in which we build things at our desks. And so these are SIP panels. They're structurally insulated panels, which are basically panels that are 10 feet, so like 3.5 meters tall. And they are constructed from a kind of foam interior with 2 sheets of plywood hugging the center. And they basically rise up from these seal plates that are kind of installed onto the floor, a little bit like one might actually install a model. So I wanted to show some of these early clips of actually like trying to understand how this sits inside of the space, that the space is measured out, taped out. The sill plate is screwed into the concrete floor as a kind of starting point for construction. So it's a kind of, literal drawing inside of the space. And then the material of the SIP, the actual plate, is basically installed directly onto the sill plate. And everything kind of comes up through this process from a kind of drawing into the model form. And the entire building takes about a week to put together. So this was a kind of way to maybe begin to understand how a construction of stone, of something that is really heavy and megalithic, can be translated into something that is actually very light, made of foam, but also in a sense translates certain qualities. So not the qualities, let's say, of weight, but the qualities of tone, of perhaps texture, and of course also of posture. So there are kind of like different ways of maybe beginning to understand what it means to look at a model, or what it means to look at a precedent, because I think that in the United States, at least, we've kind of elevated the idea of like a kind of study of formal analysis, something that draws on the quantities of certain things. But here we really took the quantities out and we only paid attention to the qualities, and tried to kind of submit this model to a kind of almost like a rendering in real life. This is also kind of a little bit of the process and the background of trying to understand how to put it together, how certain kinds of structural elements can be expressed, and also, of course, of paint, which is a very important part of this project. And so in the gallery, we kind of staged 2 things side by side. There were the photographs on the one side, and then as you looked at them backed into the actual kind of big scale of the model. And the two that were in particular of interest to me, at least, was this kind of juxtaposition of Truta's early images of, the kind of a very early automobile compared to the very kind of a late dolmen structure, not unlike, the Le Corbusier pages of the Pantheon being compared to one of the kind of high-speed vehicles. But here, of course, everything is very crude and very kind of primitive. And at the same time, there's an idea about, this is photographed in the same year, in the same landscape, with kind of a series of scale figures, not certain how to behave or how to really be in a kind of context, neither like the context of landscape and prehistoric kind of monumentality versus the context of landscape and a kind of technical object. And I think similar to us, as we kind of put this thing together, we're kind of always existing in between. A kind of practice that is a little bit related to qualities in landscape and those qualities of, let's say, technical production and machine vision. And this is what the kind of final house was presented as. The foam, of course, was still exposed. The plywood was painted a kind of dark green, translucent, but very, very diluted with water as well as glossy paint to bring out certain qualities of stone. And then the gallery itself also was kind of like painted to project a little bit of the tone of the concrete onto the wall to produce kind of wainscoting that ran around the entire gallery space to bring up the horizon line and to really match the proportions of the model to the kind of landscape, so that you can kind of begin to understand the way in which the genre of the photograph actually begins to influence the way in which we work within the walls of the gallery, in the confines of something like that, like a white box. And so within the kind of space of the gallery, of course, we also produced space for the artifacts, both for Truta's original prints and for some of our early models. And then the rest of the building is just on display. This is the top where the kind of roof breaks, just like the stone of the Bauer dolmen, but also in a way to kind of bring our attention, or at least, this is of course presented at SciArc, bring the attention of the students to the way in which certain techniques that we understand to be local to, let's say, our desks or our materials on our desks can actually translate into materials at kind of full scale. So if we work, at least in the States, we work a lot with foam core, which is the material that has a piece of foam stuck between two layers of paper. We produce models that have a kind of paper quality of construction, where the paper is actually holding together certain edges. Maybe best kind of documented in a model such as this one, where we looked at another house, Viollet-le-Duc's house in Lausanne. But in particular, we tried to kind of model this idea of, the space of the poche around one of the rooms, the one in the front, through the kind of material specificity of like layers of image making that run around the kind of perimeter of the core. And so here you can actually see that the material of foam core, when it bends corners, produces like gaps in construction. And so that is, the kind of like the roof of the dolmen in the exhibit is actually kind of drawing on some of the details that come out of these kinds of material processes that we implement on the desk. One thing that was kind of important in looking at something like a 19th century project by Viollet-le-Duc was also understanding the kind of final layer of kind of fabrication. Like in this case, the entire room is also clad in a gorgeous painting of the kind of landscape of Mont Blanc's region in the Alps. And in a sense, the kind of qualities of landscape begin to enter the interior of the actual room of the architecture. So some of these things that have to do with the more like the front face, when we looked at the Michelangelo model, like what's in the background is a kind of infrastructural support. What's in the foreground is perhaps this kind of image that is really kind of important and decorative and covered in, like paint and specificity. And so some of these things we also try to kind of bring into our work and to be influenced by, right? So these are some of our references. In particular, looking at the way in which the mural was translated from the original kind of landscape painting into the space and to the kind of specific space and measured space of the architectural interior. You can kind of see the way in which, each one of these blank squares already makes room for the fireplace and the two doors that enter the atelier, but also the way in which the scenes are cut with certain kinds of limits that then begin to translate into the corner of the room, or the construction of the pilaster in the center of the room, as well as if you start paying attention to the painting itself, where we get to the foreground of stone, it actually begins to translate into the wainscoting, and the actual material of stone begins to kind of be clad into the scene. So there is a kind of interest of bringing together different scales. And I think of this as a kind of model, let's say, right? Because it is a miniaturization or a kind of inscription of the mountain landscape directly into the space of the room. So we, of course, look at other ways of beginning to understand the kind of folded and unfolded space and how to use the space of the drawing, but now the space of the model as a way to reconstruct this. So in our own work, when we kind of begin to understand a certain quality of, rendering, of a kind of panoramic render, we begin to build it out with a kind of thick layer of material. So that has to do with the infrastructure of the wall and its wall section. Of course, all of the vernacular construction, which has to do with the kind of electrical cords with the vents, like any kind of molding, but also the kind of paint and the effect of a kind of painted wall. And this is what I mean by like moving into the background, because, trying to understand where architects fit into a kind of exhibition design. We want to kind of push back a little bit on the fact that we always have to place a model in the center. We always put it in the background, but at the same time, we also want to kind of bring out the kind of lack of neutrality of the white surface or of the white paint, and in a sense, bring out the specificity of certain kind of materials. So in this case, the panorama was produced with a series of white paints, each one bought from a different store and specified in a particular way to develop this room in the center, but really kind of working with a document that allows us to understand how, let's say, a mountain rendering can actually be translated into 5 different material groups, and in particular paint from Bear Ultra, Valspar, Dan Edwards. These are just different kind of manufacturers of paints, each one with a very different sheen and a slightly different tone that is given to the basic white, so that the entire rendering is translated through something that we've called a kind of render by number. That allows for that paint to really reveal the kind of lack of neutrality of certain manufacturing processes. And so this becomes a kind of installation, but also, hovers in the background of another artist's work. We worked here with Austrian film directors, Constanze Rum, who presented her work in the middle of the room. I wanted to end with a project that, really kind of maybe summarizes some of these things, but really started it all as well. So it's somewhere in the middle. And it's really kind of looking again at some of these megalithic structures. And in particular, not only seeing them as independent of their context, I think something that Maxime also talked about today, I like to really understand what is the context in which certain things take place. And to register that as well. So, the models kind of taking on the qualities of landscape might become important. This is just another kind of representation of different dolmens that we look at. They're, of course, from all over the world, from Spain, France, Wales, South Korea, US, etc. But, in a sense, to put a little bit of pressure on some of the modernist tropes, and in particular, like to try to replace the myth of the domino with the kind of new myth of dolmen. What would it mean to, in a sense, like push back a little bit on the, kind of, again, what I mentioned, like formal analysis, like those things that we understand to be like purely architectural, the quantities of things, with a kind of incomplete picture with a series of specimens that really kind of understands the the kind of the quality of things. And so we worked for the PS1 Museum at MoMA, developed a kind of app with Theotriantiphalides, where these monuments kind of fall from the sky, and you can begin to kind of play a game of thinking through the model as something that is really produced over and over again. So it's not a singularity any longer, but it's a really populist, let's say, tool for thinking about how to put together certain elements into a composition. And so each one becomes a kind of random and specific, but still dictated by certain qualities that we put into the process. And we started kind of building a series of these. So maybe to show a couple of examples, this one is made with brown, just brown paint and plywood. And we kind of are very specific about how some of these things are actually made. So the paint itself becomes a certain thickness that is very important. So let's say after, let's say, like 60 layers of paint, you can begin to build thickness and material thickness through the actual kind of subtraction of pieces of tape that mask out certain details. On the other hand, you can also kind of begin to understand how the screw and the screw's kind of rotation and relationship and screw type can begin to inscribe inside of the model a kind of almost neo-language, something that can begin to understand, begin to kind of orient, I guess, the viewer to a kind of almost kind of proto-language forms, right? So we can understand certain ways in which this was constructed based on the rhythms and the kind of temper of the screw form. And of course, like certain kinds of other elements that depict, let's say, the rotations that are inscribed inside of the process. This whole thing was supposed to land in MoMA PS1's courtyard. And, as you can kind of see that the ideas that I presented, the idea that these models have qualities rather than quantities, and also that we draw quite a bit from relationships to landscape, begin to really permeate through the material construction. So you can see that, the black represents a kind of like field of nails that rusticates the box. The two different tones present a kind of painted ambiguity of the subject, and so allows this to kind of land in the courtyard in a way that is a little bit maybe unexpected. So an object that is both sitting in the center, but also taking part in a kind of background condition. And we've always joked about this, like being a kind of large model, because of course, made of plywood, the whole thing would completely leak. And so in the kind of moment of rainstorm in June in New York, you'd sit underneath it and it would absolutely not protect you from any of the wetness. So the whole project was presented this way. Of course, we lost the competition, but it's a kind of sensibility that maybe replaces some of the renderings that we normally associate, with architectural kind of practices that dominate, which have like blue sky and beautiful birds and palm trees that are always hovering in the background of the work. So I'd like to thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Beautiful, thank you. Can I start, Paulo? You're the MC. Yeah, okay. I wanted to say two things, and maybe there's a question in there, but I love how you are very rigorous, or maybe rigorous is not quite the right word, but very, very, very precise about influence or references and what you allow them to do to you, right? There's no anxiety, it seems, in that. There's more of a I don't know, a capacity to extract, to let yourself be influenced, and to take that into a space which is, historically been associated with the absence of outside influences, which is the white cube, the gallery space, which behaves very much as an abstract space where there's no, where even time can be suspended, the processes which affect architecture are suspended, etc. Right? So I think that's a wonderful kind of progression that you can also take into the digital, right? When you're, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were using kind of physics engines for those models of the dolmens, right? To determine how gravity affects these giant pieces of fake stone, but you're selecting one of the qualities or the attributes that you want to be expressed there, right? Like its weight. So I don't know. I really like this this constant say decision of how much influence you let be expressed and what qualities you're bringing out in the objects, which is related to the other thing that I was thinking about in going back to Wednesday's session when Paulo was talking about the precision of say typologies or architectural models in a more, let's call it just a Western tradition or European, versus the vases that Paulo presented, which are kind of proto models or models of pre-Incan or pre-Columbian spaces, where you know, the space was determined by certain qualities or attributes, numbers of doors. It wasn't so much about dimensions and specific typologies that were being respected, but rather it was more of a topological exercise, right, in representing space. And I think that's something that relates to, I think, what you were saying about the dolmens. And in any case, it would be interesting for you to talk to Paulo about that and see those vases.
No, it's true. Paulo, I'm sorry I missed your talk 2 days ago, but I'd love to see the recording and maybe we can speak more. Gary, to your first question about the kind of white box of the gallery, I mean, of course, at the time, you know, the idea was to produce a kind of neutrality, but now we have a 100-year history of the white box. And so it becomes, right, it becomes a kind of non-neutral, it becomes a historical kind of motif, and one that has, you know, produced all kinds of now political difficulties. No, I mean, it's it's a kind of it's really not a neutral mechanism at all, in fact. And so we have to kind of always begin to address certain facts that are maybe at first considered to be you know, as in like the case of, let's say, Malevich's paintings, there's a kind of contemporaneity, you know, about their production. And now looking back, we also understand them to be, you know, historical, you know, and so in a sense, they really move categories quite a bit from how they were perceived at the time of production to how we actually inherit them as kind of 100 years later. And so I would say the same for the conceptual projects, because if the conceptual project in the kind of different media of poetry, of music, you know, of film, of painting. These are all models, at least for us, they're already 50-year-old kind of histories of these models. And so we really understand ourselves to be within that kind of post-conceptual space. Like, what does it mean? It's impossible to produce a kind of conceptual project in 2020, 2022. But maybe there is an idea about kind of taking that as a reference to actually begin to build a different rapport through a kind of truly material practice.
I had a couple of thoughts as well whilst you were presenting. First of all, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk. I thought it was very interesting in between being quite explicit about a lot of things and then let us wander with you in a way, and I quite enjoyed it. And in the other sessions, I wrote down a couple of notes about abstraction, and you started to talk about the concept of abstraction as well. And I wonder because in the beginning we talked about the pictures of Maxime. So this kind of framing is already like cutting something out of its context, right? And it's pointing towards something. And then making a model in a way is an abstraction of a reality, but it also augments other qualities. And what I really enjoyed in the Duchamp project you did with the doors is that this idea of abstraction, it's a little bit of a long remark, but the idea of abstraction, oftentimes we read it as a reduction to get to the essentials of something, right? As architects, like it becomes an aesthetic quality. And there's this book that Vittorio Aureli of Dogma wrote, like about abstraction, and he traces it back historically. And he actually points out that since antiquity, there's a distinction between manual intellectual labor and intellectual labor. The manual labor is always at service of intellectual labor. And for example, the grid comes from dividing up territory and establishing a relationship between money and land. So it's his entire political take on what abstraction is. And what I quite enjoy about the Duchamp project is that in a way it is, the model is an abstraction, but in order to make it the way you did it with the two doors, you have to completely go into the manual labor of it, right? Like you explained the details, you explained the timber and the carpentry of it. And I really enjoyed the moment where the idea through the model pushes you into that other side, like the abstraction makes it, how do I say this? Like makes it extremely concrete in a way. And I think that is my remark, because I think this question of abstraction is a larger issue that we saw today, a lot of problem that we maybe can talk about, but that's something I really enjoyed in that specific project. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's really absolutely the. I guess that's exactly what we've been kind of working through, which is to say, you know, not to take abstraction as abstract, because, you know, within the world of, let's say, if we take a kind of art historical approach, I mean, abstraction is constructed. And so that construction is specific. And so in a sense, this is like where, you know, Karl Marx begins to speak with, you know, Rosalind Krauss, right? It's like it's a way to kind of really look behind the canvas and understand how it's stretched, what its dimensions are, like what is the actual substrate, and the kind of specificity, what would be understood as medium specificity, right? Behind abstraction. So what we understood actually working through this is that abstraction is completely materialist at the same time. So there's a kind of course, linguistic, that is a kind of structuralist quality that is fully on the table as well. But that structuralism is always expressed through kind of material specificity.
Yeah.
Paulo, you're itching to speak. I can see it.
No, I just, it's not related to the discussion we have to have, but no, I want you to say something about the space of the, I really like the idea of the explorations in full-scale models, no? And the way you work with full-scale models. No, I think this space, this inversion of the Viollet-le-Duc space, for instance, or the dolmen in this is many presentations. I would like to react to a little bit more. I would like you to react a little bit more of this specific exploration in the full scale and in the space of the, I don't know if it's the gallery or this space of the exhibition as a way of practice the thinking of architecture through full scale models, you know, which I think it's really interesting because it's like like another space, like I was saying in Bancos, in which I think the model is a practice in itself. I think in the case of you and First Office, it's like radicalize that in a very interesting way, because the experience of the model is a full-scale experience, no? That I think is going to, how do I say, the effect on the observer of the one wandering around the space. We just no conozco la palabra, me he olvidado la palabra del guante que se voltea, ¿cómo se llama?
The reversed? No.
The gant. Jean, tu connais. No, the globe, yes, but the
inside of the... No.
Inside out.
Inside out.
Yeah. Oh, but okay. No, I was thinking on the tremendous effect that a full-scale exploration, for instance, of that space of that project of Viollet-Viaduc can have in anyone entering, and how different it is from the exploration of a non-full scale model. No, I just wanted to, I don't know if you can say a little bit more of that.
No, it's a really good question, Paulo. I actually don't know exactly how to answer, because it becomes almost like an instrument. I mean, the kind of space or the exposition becomes the instrument by which we can, in a sense, inscribe spatially those things that happened temporally. So if that makes sense, like in the construction site, we always work in time. We always kind of have a process, but the process becomes invisible once a building is kind of constructed, right? So the question here becomes, is there a way to inscribe into the details and the kind of spatial organization, or a kind of decorative even organization, or kind of decorative material thinking, the actual temporal process? So it becomes spatial and becomes visual. So in a sense, like visualizing or making visible for the audience all the kinds of thinking that went behind in the background in order to put something together. And so in a sense, it becomes almost like a conversation with somebody who enters the space, because, you know, on the one hand, a child can enter the kind of dolmen house and just see it as a kind of awkward space. But, you know, at the same time, like an architect can enter the same space and see something very different. So there are multiple kind of translations that are possible, or like maybe even like meanings that can be derived from this.
I think that might be related to something that I wanted to also ask you to maybe develop a little bit more, which is the contrast between form as formulaire and form as form. No? And what I immediately thought of is like, yeah, in the case of a formulaire, the information that you say input into a formulaire is of entirely different order than the result of that formulaire, which can be an event, it can be a certificate, something that is completely different. So in the case of a death certificate, it's not the dead body, it's a name, a biopsy, you know, it's things that are not quite related to the form, essentially. And I wonder to what extent that describes a design process, or is just an interesting play in words for us, or but I find it very, very compelling as a way of thinking of, you know, can you start with the qualities of architecture and not immediately jump into form, because at the same time the fascination with the dolmen is a fascination with form. So I don't know. I like the contradiction there, but maybe you can talk more about it.
No, that's a really good question. I also think about it now because we're just kind of now writing about it. So I think it's a work in progress. But you know, I hope it's more than just a game of words, because I mean, I think the formulaire is a kind of bureaucracy or a bureaucratic form of thinking. And the bureaucracy, especially, you know, I mean, I think it's everywhere in architectural profession, but especially in the United States, the bureaucracy governs quite a bit about what's possible. And so when we look creatively at bureaucratic forms, and they have to do with the specificity of different material groups or of construction practice, then we can actually begin to be creative, like within the industry itself. And so it's really like, on the one hand, it's quite symbolic, but on the other hand, it's very literal. Like we're actually looking at the forms as things that provide a kind of guidance for, and produce certain kinds of limits for form making. So the form and like the kind of creative process happens in certain ways in the details of filling these things out. Like literally, what is your name? What is the material's name? What is the kind of material specificity? What kind of screw, what kind of glue, what kind of paint is necessitated by the specification contract. All of those things are inscribed, and actually we follow those things quite precisely with a little bit of kind of freedom. So, and then the other kind of question, I think, the second part of, Gary, your question is like the dolmen as a kind of form, but at the same time, I mean, the dolmen is also kind of myth. Here I kind of use that word in a kind of Barthes sense, but like it's a myth because we don't actually know anything about what its construction is for. Like there's no function really that has been described, but we do know that its construction is very difficult because it is very heavy. And so it requires an entire kind of like population, like more than, let's say, one author, but like multiple people to really come together. So it becomes a kind of myth of origin of architecture because an entire village has to produce a kind of series of instruments or, like earthworks in order to construct something like this. And so we always think about the dolmen not only as just like the object in the landscape, but as it once was a kind of instrument for producing community and producing that kind of original space. And the kind of idea of working together with something that's quite heavy, right? So there's, in this one object, you have like the duality between what is it represented as in the photograph, which is one kind of image, which is kind of like the frontal image of its kind of shape, its figure. But then at the same time, what lurks in the background is the kind of narrative of the myth of a village kind of coming together to build something quite heavy.